Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ariel Jones, and I am the Development Officer here at MOCA GA, and it is my pleasure to present tonight's Working Artist Project Talk with Myra Greene. Myra Greene utilizes fabric, dye, silk screening, and sewing to further explore representations of race and the body. At the center of Greene's practice is a consideration of how our understanding of color is completely dependent on context, materially, culturally, and historically. The MOCA GA Working Artist Project is an awards program to support visual artists of merit who reside in the metropolitan Atlanta area. This initiative provides an unparalleled level of support for individual artists, expands the museum's mission, and promotes Atlanta as a city where artists can live, work, and thrive. This program is supported by grants from the Charles Loridans Foundation, the Antinori Foundation, the AEC Trust, with additional funding from the National Endowment for the Arts. Now, without further ado, I will present Miss Myra Greene.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank you all for coming out this evening. You can be anywhere else, so I always appreciate your time. I want to thank Eric, who's been an amazing support installer, preparator for this show, and all of the staff, Emily, Allison, Stacy, who have helped me really bring this all together. Many of you know I'm a professor. I teach at Spelman, so it's easiest for me to give slideshows opposed to sort of walk from piece to piece. And I'm also a photographer, and I also pace, so this format works very well for me. So I'm going to take you through a new talk, a new lecture, 30 slides. It's a lot more storytelling than I normally do, but hopefully we'll get to how the conceptual underpinnings, the mayhem that's happened, all of the processes that are sort of embedded in this through this. My goal is a slide a minute, but I don't know if we're going to get there. But so a question started a while back as I started making things. I'm known as a photographer, and while I'm still always in love with photography, questions about the strength of representation started to float in my mind. And I started to think about what photography does well and what photography can't do, and how photography points at things, and what does it mean to point. And does anything happen at the end of that pointing? And so it just sort of got more and more complicated as I move forward. I'm going to stop and say like 4 things. I'm also giving this talk as if you know everything about me already, so I'm not going to explain a ton about previous work. I'm also giving this talk sort of, I guess if I was imagining who I'm talking to good friends who will appear in the slide lecture. So I'm just bringing you on the journey. So there's I'm just giving assumptive knowledge. Like, I'm going to be like, yeah, so you know these things, these ambrotypes, character recognition, 3 by 4 inches, made them in 2006. And they're self-portraits, and they're pictures of my body. And I was just interested in how these started to fail in my imagination. Because I thought, while looking at this body, are we just lusting or loathing blackness, the blackness that's in these pictures? Or how is representation sort of not going into further than pointing? How is that metaphor not really being deciphered or considered in a complicated way? So after this, I did a project called My White Friends. And these are my white friends. The woman in the middle you will see later. And actually, all of these slides sort of reference upon each other, so look for details. They're clues. I'll ask you if you saw the clue in another picture. But pointing at whiteness, what does that mean? Do you not even see it? Do you see privilege? Do you see normalcy? Do you see odds and ends? And I just sort of was done with the ability, or needed to take a step back from photography in the ways it dealt with representation and the ways it dealt with my own self-identity. So I tried to figure out what I wanted to do and try to answer some internal questions that were odd ones, that were personal ones, that I don't talk about, not with my friends. I mean, I don't know how many conversations you have about self-identity or where you fit in and your blackness and your existentialism. I don't really do that anywhere except for in my studio. So somehow I got to fabric. I mean, I say somehow, but not really. This work started, and some of it has been made on a sewing machine I got in grad school in 1999 that just still exists in my studio. So fabric has been a part of my existence for a while. It's just never been forefronted. And the new, this new project, or sort of these are the seedlings to what you see on the wall. And I started with sort of cutting up African fabric, making collages, physical collages that I would then photograph and then make photographic prints of. And so just sort of still holding on to this photograph. But in that process, I would take this time, 2013, to move forward and learn a bunch of different processes or expand my own making. I will learn to quilt, embroider, silkscreen, just through workshops after work. You know, you're like, I'm done with work. Let me go learn how to, I don't know, learn a French knot on a Tuesday afternoon from 7 to 9. So this is a show, 2015, which featured sort of this quilt work and these photographs that sat on the wall. And it's really a question of using African fabrics as a deconstruction and a construction to sort of create a new dialogue or a new type of portrait. And this sort of culminated in this show, but I started making what is probably the sister work, and so now we're off of mothers, but into sisters and cousins of the stuff you see in the wall. This is around 2017, and this is the work that pretty much appeared in my application for the WAP. And you see sort of the tenets of the piece sitting right next to it. A silkscreen pattern that's made of a shiny metallic sitting on a color field. And you know, you make these things, and I tell my students, none of them, I don't think any of them are here, so I can say it. I tell my students, make 20. I just walk up to them, and if I think something looks good, I just go 20, and I walk away, and they go, duh. And it's a compliment, because I think if something looks good and you don't know what it is, you just keep making it over and over and over again until you sort of can answer some questions. And I was probably on number 15, 16 when my friends and colleagues, the gallery I work with, Patron, came to Atlanta, or actually no, I brought these up north, and we started thinking about, like, well, how do these relate to my white friends? How do these relate to character recognition? And what are the, like, sort of what are the links? And the link, ironically, it was always color. And so at the same time I was working on these, I extended character recognition to be a new project that's called Undertones. And so it is that same glass plate ambrotype 19th century process, which puts image onto glass that you saw on the first slide, that is starting to apply and look at and be applied to stained glass. And this is sort of this crucial moment in which I started having a understanding about color in so many ways. And so color became completely contextual. Color became situational. And so images would appear or disappear, reflect, be seen, depending on the situation that they were around. If they were masked in whiteness, sometimes clear glass would be only a shadow, opposed to seeing the actual skin. And when they were masked in blackness, sometimes that color would be sucked away, and they would become neutral. And it became this actual physical, literal metaphor of understanding that color is contextual, that color is situational, and that metaphor applying out to thinking about the ways I think about race and self. So these two images come from the show I had in, the show called Undertone, that was in London in 2018. And then recently the work has sort of come out of the frame to sort of try to remove that situationalness, I guess, or sort of that heavy-handedness of color. They now sit on these plexi plates, and so the shadow itself releases the color, right? And so you can see these purples and blues underneath. And with all of these, the colors that were picked or the successful images to me, or how we sort of wrangled in the work that was made, was thinking about the undertones of Blackness and the undertones of color and tone and family and sort of these stories you hear about Blackness. I'm going to get into that in a second. So, we have our purples and reds and browns and purples. I love them. This is our two transitional slides. What am I reading? What am I thinking about? How does it function? And I think at this moment, I realized I was starting a language of abstraction, a personal language of abstraction that felt new. Anyone who works through abstraction or follows Sam Gilliam or William T. Williams will sort of know that there's sort of this space where, or Howard Dina Pindell, how they're making is sort of not associated with the things that are going on around them, but just sort of in their own internal secret thinking. And so these are the books that sort of really underpinned everything that happened right after I applied for the grant and for the WAB. Two things in particular, in two separate slides, you see the Albers, Joseph Albers and Annie Albers. Joseph Albers being the man of color, the color and paint, that will tell you that if you put a blue next to another blue, it will look different if you put it next to a red. Ironically, this image on the right-hand side, left-hand side, is a New York Times game, which is a matching game. This was like the best thing that happened this summer. It just came up and it was like, play Joseph Albers on your New York Times. Like, match this yellow to this yellow, but it situationally looks different because it's sitting next to this green in this slide, but a blue on this side. And I was like, I would play it all day. And I would get the longest combo would be perfect matches, and I would be unsatisfied unless I got a perfect match to understand my situational color. He was married to Annie Albers, if you don't know who she is a textile artist, who did the same type of thinking about how color is situational, how color will vibrate when it sits next to each other. But she did it all with textiles, not with paint, not with mix, right? Literally by putting fabric next to fabric, becoming a master weaver. And so I like this because I think there's this, there's a whole conversation we could have about women and making and craft that undertones that story, in which these two people are having the same conversations about color with varied degrees of institutional success or recognition until today. Annie Albers had a retrospective at the Tate in summer of 2018, and I missed it, and I was very upset. Situational color. It's a visual thing, right? How does that yellow look next to that blue? But it's a lived thing. This is my situational color. This is me in second grade. That classroom looked very different when I walked in the room, right? And it's something that has always become, it's always something, I show this slide all the time. My friend Patrick always goes, which one are you? And I'm like, I'm the tall one. And he laughs. He's mixed Swedish and Detroit. But this type of situational color, situational racial color is with me all the time. And I don't know how well people recognize how these things play out. I was in China in 2011 for the first time, traveling with my colleagues, all good friends and 2 graduate students. And people, my friend Ross, was like, this guy. I was like, white guy. Well, that white guy. I was like, you didn't know the other one's Australian. I was like, the Australian and the white guy. But that guy, white guy, he's like, do you realize everyone's following you? Do you realize everyone's looking at you? I was like, yeah. And he's like, no, do you realize? He's like, I'm not. He's like, I thought we would be looked at because we're in small town China and we're Americans. But do you realize that people are watching you? At a photo conference, this is what was happening behind me at all times. I would stand in the street and people would stand next to me, make a peace sign, and someone from far away was making their picture. my situational color was impossible to understand in some ways. This also happened this summer. I went to Greece, and this is my friend Seema, and we were at the archaeology museum, and the ticket attendant asked us if we were sisters, and meant it. He was like, no, seriously, you guys are sisters, right? No. Why are you two together? Our situational brownness made no sense to people on, on boats and, all of the travels. The idea that, middle-class blackness and travel was insane for many of the Greeks, but we had a good time. From my white friends. I don't take this to say that this happens to me alone. This is Dwayne Flynn, one of the portraits in my white friends. And people always sort of look at this and with any photograph, will write the story or assume the character. But his situational awareness is very different because he's my brother-in-law. Right? And so imagine a 6'4" hockey-sized guy walking through Harlem for 25 years, right? Calling my grandmother, we'll get to her in a second. So this situational color matters, and I think it's experienced by many, but not sort of known as to how to talk about it, or I don't think a photograph could handle it. And so, in some ways, thinking about color in my art has become the way I articulate this idea. Oh, I forgot that picture. This is at my opening in London, and it was just very funny. It's me, my mother, and my sister on that side, and my two friends from Chicago. And depending on who I was with at the opening, people would treat me very differently, right? Because if I was with black folks, they were like, ooh, I don't know. And they're like, oh, tall blonde woman. That's the golfer lady, if you missed it from the first picture. So, so this picture was taken on August 5th, and August 5th was the day that the title for this show was due, and I had written 1,000 titles for this show. And a show title doesn't work when nobody asks about it. So the title of the show is Interval, and it's really because I literally was going through my phone and thinking about, well, what is it? And all the things about tones and undertones seem too aggressive to tell the story with. And I was actually interested in more what happened in this time period, what happened from accepting the award to sort of the installation of the show. And it really all started on August 5th when I relearned. First time I learned how to dye fabrics, it was a disaster. And everything was purple. But this time, with the help of my friend Nora, who's really a guiding force in this project, really sat down and learned to dye properly fabrics. It started with sort of just thinking about browns. And I literally just bought every brown fabric there was, or brown dye, and these are the tests for them. And she slowly taught me how to ombre dye, how to make dyes change colors over time and intensity of dye. So everything sort of starts in the bath in a very loose bath, in a very light bath, and every 2 minutes, which are those tick marks on the side, you would add more dye to the mix as you pull the fabric out. But there was something uninteresting about this, and so in talking with Nora, we sort of went through and I was like, this is great, and I would ombre dye the other way, meaning I would do all these things, and I was like, Nora, I'm unsatisfied. And she simply said, because you have no undertone. And I knew immediately what she meant, right? There was no tone to the materials that I was dyeing. So the simple color wheel. I knew that perhaps the process that I had decided was incorrect. And so what I started doing is dyeing each fabric its complementary color, right? So you can look across the room, or rather the one behind me. This starts out as an orange fabric. It is actually dyed navy blue to sort of push it to brown, right? So my goal was to, instead of sort of to use the tone of something, to use the original material to help push it, to manipulate it back to the fabric color. So that yellow is actually dyed an intense purple, that blue is dyed a rich red, and therefore my dye cabinets I now have every color in the rainbow, because I'm trying to like figure out, I just sort of look at a fabric and I'm like, your opposite may not be as as you may think it is. So to me, well, this requires a lot of water. I'm looking at Sonia, she knows dyeing well. But to me, this process is the same as any type of photomechanics, right? It's putting a bunch of things in it's putting a substrate with a material that changes it, and then you wash it, and then you wash it again. And to me, it's photography of fabric. It's not to me this generally insane thing. And so it's the same as printing any type of black and white, silver, fiber paper. So, but embedded all of this is just, of course, another series of metaphors. And to take you back through what I think about with my family. My father died when I was 6 months old, and so I only have these like amazing pictures of him because I think he looks like a badass. This is like my favorite picture, which my mother's erased in her own gown, and he's like, what? Right? But there's something about him, is that my father was described as frying pan black. He was described as blue-black. He had the darkest of skin, which against my mother, who you can see her light, fair face just peeking out of the corner, was just sort of this really interesting contrast. So I was interested in, like, how do you get a blue, black, brown? Which is funny, because the next slide is the picture standing right next to me. So it's like, whoa. How do you get to that blue, that is black, that is brown? My grandmother had 5 sisters. My grandmother's a survivor. She's the last remaining sister. And they were all high yellow, a term black people know very well. This is my grandmother. And in the middle there. And it's always this interesting thing, because I was not the tone of my grandmother or any of her sisters. This is her sister, Geraldine, who goes by Rosie, because she was as pretty as a rose. But she could also pass for white. And at times would be holding my mother's hand and be asked, why are you holding that nigger's hand? Right? So there's a brown to me that is yellow. There is a brown to me that emotionally is that tone. And that becomes really important to sort of the structure of the work. They don't all fall into such strange narratives. It's interesting to me because it's not as if I think the blue-black, that black is a frying pan, that is always a term when I think about brown skin or blackness that has always come to me. This idea of thinking about high yellow is not something I understood until I looked at that piece, because I knew it doesn't feel brown to many. It doesn't emulate black skin to many, but for me it truly does. To speak of this pattern, because I sort of skipped over it before, I was deconstructing, right? And so a lot of this is deconstructing, reconstructing, creating your own language of abstraction. And so people are always like, where does this pattern come from? Where does the pattern of the silkscreen come from? And what I physically, literally did was these are a part of the collection of fabrics that I have in my archives of African fabrics. And so you sort of see this repeated sort of pattern here, right? You see that? It's a wax Dutch relief that is a part of dyeing processes, but is also like an undertone and under patterning of the work itself. And so what I did is I took that out digitally, made a silkscreen pad, or took it out digitally, made it into a repeatable onto a silkscreen, and then printed them. So you can see, well, you can sort of see in studio. I gotta thank you, Dana, for my table that made everything work. He built that table. God bless that table. Because it could hold a 2-yard piece of fabric, which became the quintessential amount of how to silkscreen everything. But all of that gets printed. And what happens when you, after you've ombreed, so you can see here the ombre of the fabric that then goes to brown, but you can also see that the color applied shifts as you look at the fabric, right? The color, it's the same ink, right? But it's under its own contextualization changes as it sits on the die. And that's sort of that intense metaphor that I'm trying to work through with all of the work. So the shape sort of came late to the game. They are, I really was conscious, if we go back to the ideas of craft and sort of 2 images ago, how this, if you look at it, sometimes looks like a pillowcase, or people want to put it on their bed. That's what everyone always said to me. That would look great on my bed. And I was like, that's not what I'm trying to make. So I had to come up with ways in which to break that and to sort of charge the shape into something interesting. And these were sort of the first 2 iterations before I started dyeing, in which the shapes sort of start to grow out of their own abstraction. And they're really based sort of on, piece in the back, based on the triangle. The triangle potentially has, this is the joke, this is my failed joke. The triangle, right? Anyway, thank you. Okay, so thank you. 3 people who like sports. I watched the 30 for 30 when I did that. No, okay. I'm going to keep it. The triangle potentially has the passage, the diaspora implication of trade, of African movements. It's a really heavy-handed one. And if you look, and I can scroll back, but it would be a long time, this actual line pattern appears in one of those hanging quilts as I use that sewing of that map into an early piece. But realistically, I think of the triangle really basically and pretty simply, and it's the triangle between me, my mother, and my sister. So I always think of the photograph as a relationship, but particularly this photograph, which is the favorite one of me and my mom and my sis. I am absent in that triangle, but I am present in that triangle because the photograph could not exist without me. So we live in 3 different cities and have for a very long time, but it's always a relationship pull between me, my sis, Ayola, and my mother. And so when people are, there's both this tension between the idea of the triangle of diaspora and this personal triangle, which is me, my mother, and my sister. So that is the end of my talk, which sort of has no true end. It's just like, end done. I don't have a wrap up. I didn't close it very well, but I did keep it within my allotted time period, which is really what I'm most excited about. So I appreciate you all coming out, and I'm always here for any of your questions and thoughts and comments. Yay, Alex. Yes. Yes. I mean, this gets into a very long conversation, but yes, I think I will return to photography? Yes. But what's fascinating to me, out of all of the mediums, photographers are the one who will just be photographers, but rarely will say, I'm an artist, or rarely allow themselves to sort of dip their toe into that scary ground called installation. Textiles, it seems like people expect photographers to function in a very specific way. I resist that because I think each medium has a limitation, right? I recognize that this show is potentially conceptual for some, so it just leaves them with beauty. And that representation might be an easier way for some to answer these questions. But I don't want to be easy, she says. Okay, sorry, it just came out too easy. So, I think it was interesting to me with the ACP and, you're known for what you do. I'm known because I made character recognition. I'm known because I made my white friends, but it doesn't mean that I necessarily have to personally believe that I have to stay in that space. There are dozens of contemporary artists who make those jumps through those materiality hoops that I appreciate, and work in that vein. Next question, Alex. Say that again? What's my complementary color? Oh, God. What's my color? It's like the first question. I gotta choose a color. I have this weird propensity to orange, but it's like people have noticed it in my shoes, but I've had it for decades. So then, therefore, my complementary color would be navy. Navy.
Approaching it in a non-objective way so that you can still have this mystery.
Right. So, it does. I'm trying to answer it I think for me, this clarity around August last year around thinking about brownness as material became the abstract thought that led me to make non-objective objects. Does that make sense? So that I could then step back and then, there's plenty of failures that are not in the room, right? But there had to be a way in which I could critique how an object functioned, even though it might successfully go to black or ink might successfully sit on top of it, right? I could sit and discern that yes, the object spoke about these ideas of abstraction, but they objectively weren't aesthetically correct. Does that make sense? I'd have to show you pictures on my phone. There's a purple one, there's a yellow one that's just all yellow. I just put so much dye and I just messed it up, but it's this beautiful yellow on yellow on yellow on yellow on yellow, which could do it. But it didn't talk about that transition, that the thoughts in which how brown is created or that transition were void in the object. So the object couldn't live in the space, right? It exists. It's numbered, as a part of the series, but it will probably never be shown, right? Brown is freaking hard in a good way. In a beautiful way, and it fascinates me still to this day as to how many variants and tones, and we could do this. I obsessively, when I taught color photography, would take my kids to the Home Depot and just touch paint chips all day to talk about color, and they were just like, "What is wrong with?" I just bring in paint chips and be like, "Let's talk about color and its emotive tones," and they're like, "No." So yeah, it's a hard thing because you, again, don't, even if you go, okay, I'm adding a warm color to a cold color, you don't know if you're going to get a warm brown or a cold brown because you don't know which one's going to push on top. So some of those are technical problems. So I don't know if that's abstraction problems or non-objective project. Yes. Blue, black, you're right. Blue, black is brown. But when I say blue, black to people, everyone's like, I know exactly what you're talking about. I have a cousin, right? Yes. Oh, boy. We're going to start up here, and then we'll come around. Yes. Photomechanical. They are digitally made, large prints made at Staples, burned at Atlanta Printmaking Studio. So, I broke it. I really broke it. There it is. So the pattern, the pattern is literally, you see this? So I would scan this, copy it, scan this, copy it, and then make a digital pattern. Meaning that there's no way to sort of put things together neatly. You sort of repeat it, rotate it, and massage a thing into it to make a 1824 screen. I wish I had bigger screens, but actually in the end it worked out pretty well. And so I've made maybe 20 of those. Just if I'll just be like, oh, that's dead. It's really hard because it's an unreadable pattern when you print it. You can print it right next to each other and it doesn't matter. So in the printing, if it makes sense, you sort of print off so that it can dry and it doesn't stick to everything. But you're really just putting the same thing next to each other every 18 inches or so. But you won't recognize it, or it's really, really hard to recognize it. And then there are two different sizes, and so there's a small tight pattern and a big loose pattern. And then they're also printed, I don't think as much in the show, but I also have screens that are positive and negative so that I could flip what the ink is. Is the ink the fabric, or is the ink the screen? And so that also tricks the eye. I didn't really talk about this, but for me, and I think Annie Albers does this really well, is I like that idea of vibration, and that idea that it's really difficult to figure out what is coming forward and what's pushing back. And so all of these little tricks of size change, of positive, negative, are kind of like fundamental 2D design, but they actually really do trick you into going, what's happening there? And that, to me, becomes really exciting. I think it works really well in that piece. You're just sort of like, that blue is not the same blue, and it gets icy, and then it's warm, and oh, God. So, yeah. What? I don't really know, because I did. Sure, let's say yes. Okay. Because there's another one. I also have a problem where I make a Prince piece every time. That's something that's so Prince related that my friend's like, you cannot put a Prince piece in the show. And I'm like, okay. So I don't know if it's this one or the another one in my studio. Ellie? No. No. Here's the thing, really simply, really quickly. I think that is the association of the history of craft, right? My mother, God bless her, I took her to a fabric store and she's like, why do people do this? It's like, okay, just sit here. Like, there's no crafting in my family. So the Gies Ben is a generational black communities of quilting. That's not it. I started working with textiles in 2013. When I was living in Chicago. That show was that quilting show, which I will never get back to. I just don't think maybe I'm pointing it the wrong way. Come on, or doesn't like me, I'm too fast. Just a reminder, it was a great talk, wasn't it? I forget what I'm looking for all of a sudden. I got it, show in Chicago, got it. It's coming up shortly. Maybe not. Anyway. It'll just keep going. Because I want to show you that other thing there. So this was Chicago 2015. Here's that marking again, so you can, I think about stitches, I mean, there's a lot of other things I could talk about, but I want it to be pretty specific for this talk, but thinking about stitches as maps and where you've been and how you've been. And so sort of burying that, I mean, the stitch is an interval of time, which is also very photographic to me. And so there's also a lot of embedded time in sort of looking at these things. But there was a question. Is it you? Yeah. Hi. Please. Thank you. Well, everything should be accessible to everyone. Everything should be accessible to everyone. I know some people. I know what you're saying. I tried hard in a sickened coma to make sure that happens, because that's when I did the talk. But I feel like this was the opportunity to do that, because I feel like this is a show that feels, when you walk in, might not be translatable, but it really is. And it just, and that's why I put seats on the, so you could sit down and sort of think about, well, what is happening? What is the relationship between these things? And so hopefully people can sit down and sort of see this brown or think, or just even be like, it's about color, and then sort of think about color for a moment. If that's all that happens, I'd be really happy. Any more questions? Well, thank you all for your time. I appreciate it.